my work, or some of our work here to this audience. So this is joint work with Fabrizio Mazzona, who used to be at NEA, but now is in Lugano. So we've already heard a little bit about the financial and economic crisis and its effect, and I'd like to go into more details in this talk. So, this is probably not news for you. So 2007, 2008, we had a big financial and economic crisis that was a major macroeconomic shock to many European countries, and it might have affected private households on many different levels. So, for example, households might have become unemployed, they might have lost income, there might have been drops in wealth, etc. And then more recently, there is a recent sovereign debt crisis, which might also have additional consequences for European economies and also for private households, in the sense that there are cuts to government expenditure, which might, for example, affect health budgets. So the question that we would like to ask in this paper is, how does the recent macroeconomic turbulence affect public health, and how does it affect the health of older Europeans? So there are a couple of potential channels that you might think of when you think about the relation between macroeconomic circumstances and individual health. And one of the channels is, for example, that people become unemployed, or they might experience financial hardship, which increases stress and has long-term consequences for their health. They might adopt unhealthy lifestyles, or they might become depressed because of the difficult economic circumstances that they're facing. In addition to that, reductions in income and wealth might lead to lower investments in health if people cannot afford health care anymore, or can only afford lower quality health care. And in addition to that, the reduction of public expenditure on health services due to tight budgets might also lead to less quality of health care, and then less health of the people who are living currently. Now, these are all channels that might negatively affect health of people in more difficult macroeconomic circumstances, but up to this point, the empirical evidence is not clear, because there might also be some other channels that go in the opposite way. And that is, for example, less economic activity might reduce job-related health problems. There might be less stress. If before the crisis you had more job stress, or there might be fewer job-related accidents or car accidents. Then you might all of a sudden have more time for a healthy lifestyle because you have lower opportunity cost of time, or you might smoke or drink less. If smoking and drinking are normal goods, and if income is reduced, then people might reduce smoking and drinking. So from this, the evidence is, or from a theoretical perspective, it's not so clear whether you would expect a positive effect of the macroeconomic crisis on health or negative, and also the empirical evidence up to this point is not clear. Now, our contribution is that we examine the effects of the recent crisis on health of older Europeans. They might, on the one hand, be more affected by the macroeconomic crisis because their health tends to be more fragile, if you look at older people. Then, on the other hand, many of the channels that I just pointed out were via the labor market, and so if older people tend to have less tight links to the labor market, they might actually be less affected by the current macroeconomic turbulence. So it's not clear what effects to expect ex ante. What we're doing is we're using share individual level data on health in combination with regional data on employment rate that we take from Eurostat, and we take the information at the NUTS1 level, that is the regional level just below the country level. So for example, in Germany, that would be the Länder level. So we're exploiting within country regional differences in the intensity of the crisis to look into the effects that the crisis had on health of older people. And we're exploiting the regional variation. So how do we measure the changes in health? We are using respondents from Share Wave 2, so that was the wave in 2006, before the crisis. And then we're adding information after the crisis from the just published share weight 4 data, and we're looking at the following countries: Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Austria, Spain, Italy, and Poland. And so we've restricted in the number of countries in two ways. The first way is that the countries had to participate in wave 2 and wave 4, and the second restriction is that we have to have information on employment rates at the NUTS 1 level. And so, for example, in Denmark, we didn't have this information up to that point. That's why we didn't include. So this is not working for us. Okay, so the dependent variable we're looking at is self-reported health, and that is the self-rating of health going, would you say your health is excellent to poor on a 5-point scale, and we focus on changes in health between the two waves, as I already explained. So our dependent variable can take values from -4 to 4, where negative values mean that the health is worse in 2010 compared to 2006, and a positive value will mean that the health improved between the two waves. Now, then we add a couple of controls. As you already heard, SHARE is a quite rich data set, so we have all kinds of information on these people. And here in this paper, we're actually only taking few, but one of the ideas that we have in mind is to exploit more information later on. So let me explain quickly the crisis measure. So we are using employment rates, a time series of employment rates from 1999 to 2010, and then we're detrending. So we're only using the cyclical component of the employment, so because they have been raising employment rates of the older population in Europe and all countries, and we don't want to capture the trend in the increase in employment rates over time, but we only want to have the shock. So we detrend the time series, and then we only use the deviations from this trend in 2008 in order to get some idea of how difficult the crisis was in certain regions. And so if you look at the darker regions on this graph, these were regions where the employment rate among people 55 to 64 deviated most negatively from the 10-year, 12-year trend. Now, if you look at the lighter shades, then you see that some countries even deviated in a positive way from the 10-year, 12-year trend. So we have a substantial variation in employment rates in 2008, which is the year we're looking at, and which actually gives a lot of strength to the analysis that we are doing. Now, in this graph, this is a first descriptive analysis of the relationship between health and the intensity of the crisis. So within country, we split the regions into those with above median employment and below median employment deviations. And we, in this graph, look at the changes in self-reported health. So with the exception of Poland, we find that over the 4 years, the health became worse for people, which is not surprising because people became 4 years older. So that is kind of what you would expect. Now what is interesting is to compare the lighter bars and the darker orange bars, because there you can see that in regions that were more affected in a negative way by the macroeconomic conditions, the health became worse. Now in this graph you see that it's only significant in Sweden, Germany. Then if we look at those employed, it also becomes significant in the Netherlands. But let me go on and show you results from our regression analysis. Okay, so this is a simple ordinary least squares regression where the dependent variable is again the change in subjective health, and our main explanatory variable is the variation in the regional employment rates, or the deviation from the trend. And what you can see here is that if we take the full SHARE sample, so the whole age range, we find a negative and significant effect of the macro conditions on health. Now, if we only look at the people aged 50 to 70, the effect becomes slightly stronger. And then if we additionally condition on being in employment in 2006, which is the last column that you can see, the effect becomes almost double. So we take this as a first indication that somehow the connection between macroeconomic circumstances and health seems to be related to labor market participation of those people. Now, we looked a little bit into the strength of the effect by different education groups, and what we find here is that actually surprises a little bit is that if we only look at the age group 50 to 70 and we split it into high school dropouts, those with high school and those with a college degree, we find the largest effect on those with a college degree. Now this is surprising because usually you would find stronger effects on those with lower education because they tend to be more affected by unemployment or changes in income. Now, in this graph, or in this regressions, we did not condition on labor market experience previously, and so what we did then is we conditioned on being in the labor market in 2006. And what you can see here now is the effect on the high school dropouts who were still employed in 2006 doubles, even though our sample is reduced by 2/3. And so what we see here is that conditional and still being employed in the labor market, the high school dropouts are affected as badly as those with a college degree, but they tend to be out of the labor market more frequently. So again, we take this as evidence that the effects of the crisis on health are channeled through the labor market. Now, we split the sample into 3 macro regions, the Mediterranean countries, the Central European countries, and the Northern countries. And again, surprisingly, we find the largest effect in the Northern countries. If we only look at the age range, but that's actually a very similar story. If we condition on employment, then we lose about 2/3 of the sample in the Mediterranean countries. However, the effect goes back to almost the same level as in the Northern countries. So let me quickly summarize. We find that the current crisis seems to have a negative effect on old age health. About 1 percentage point lower employment rate among those 50 to 64 has a negative effect on health equivalent about 1 more additional year of age. And the effects that we find are stronger for individuals who are still in the labor force, in 2006. And they are stronger in the northern countries due to a higher labor force participation among the older population. Now, let me quickly point to possible policy conclusions. So what for sure is important when thinking about designing policies to overcome the current crisis, one should bear in mind that the crisis might have an impact on public health. And the final thing is that if we think about increasing labor market participation of older Europeans, one has to bear in mind that they are then more prone to macroeconomic effects, and that might have a negative effect on their health. However, before we jump to conclusions there, I think more research is necessary to clearly understand the underlying mechanisms, and that is why we really appreciate the rich data sources of the SHARE data set, because we can now, in the next step, look more into the effects of the crisis on unemployment, on income variation, etc., to understand what actually drives the link between macroeconomic circumstances and health that we